there is a memory imprinted upon the mud of Avoyelles Parish. A story the silt still tells when the air grows heavy and the cicadas drone their vespers. It is a tale not of water alone, but of what the water unburies, and what it chooses to keep forever. In the spring of 1927, the Old Man River, that great chthonic god of the American continent, shrugged its earthen shackles and swallowed the world whole. It was not a flood. It was a baptism and a burial, a liquid erasure of boundaries, of property lines, of life and the illusion of its permanence. The Great Flood, they called it, a name too sterile, too biblical for the reality of the thing. It was a slow, creeping apocalypse of brown water, a tide of liquid earth that devoured homes, drowned cattle where they stood, and turned the vibrant green of the bayou into a vast, sepulchral mirror reflecting only a merciless, indifferent sky. For months, there was no land, only the tops of cypress trees standing like skeletal mourners in a drowned cemetery. There was the sound of water lapping against the roofs of sunken chapels, the ceaseless lament of insects, and a silence from humanity that was heavier and more profound than any scream. When the waters finally, reluctantly, began to recede, they did not restore what they had taken. They left behind a world transformed, a landscape suffocated under a blanket of stinking ochre mud. It was a new Genesis, born of decay. The sun, once a life-giver, now beat down with a malevolent intensity, baking the mud into a cracked, leprous skin over the bones of the old world. The air grew thick with the sweet, cloying perfume of rot, the miasma of a million tiny deaths that clung to the back of the throat and soured the taste of salvaged grain. Into this purgatory of rot and resilience came Thomas Finney, a man haunted not by the spirits of the bayou, but by the far more tangible ghosts of his own ambition. He was a journalist from New Orleans, a city that knows its own relationship with the water's whims, but the ink on his fingers was stained with the tarnish of disgrace. A story built on whispers and bad judgment had cost him his reputable position, casting him into the orbit of lesser papers that paid in cents per word and cared little for truth beyond its capacity to sell. He came to Avoyelles not as a crusader for fact, but as a penitent seeking a simple narrative for a Sunday paper, a tale of human endurance to cauterize his own professional wounds. He was looking for stoic farmers, for tearful reunions, for the quiet heroism that blooms in the wake of catastrophe. He was a man of logic, of cause and effect, a believer in the printed word as a bulwark against the chaos of rumor and superstition. The bayou, he thought, was just a place on a map, its people just subjects for a story. He was a fool. He did not yet understand that the bayou is not a place, but a presence, and its stories are not told. They are absorbed. They seep into you, through the soles of your worn leather shoes, through the humid air you breathe, through the watchful, unblinking eyes of the egrets that stand like silent sentinels on the limbs of dead trees. He spent his first days in the parish documenting the obvious, the back-breaking labor of men digging out their lives from the muck, the quiet grief of women sorting through the water-warped remnants of their homes, the gaunt faces of children who had forgotten the feeling of dry ground beneath their feet. He spoke with Sheriff Brody, a man whose exhaustion seemed to have settled deep into his bones, a man who wore his badge not as a symbol of authority, but as a testament to its utter collapse in the face of God's raging torrent. The stories were all the same, a litany of loss, a chorus of survival. Finney wrote them, down in his sweat-stained notebook, his neat, practiced script. A small act of order in a world undone. But he felt a hollowness in these accounts, a sense that the true story of this place was not in the shared, communal tragedy, but in something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface of the collective grief. He felt it in the way people would stop talking when he approached, in the long assessing stares that followed him from the porches of makeshift shacks, in the silences that fell between words, silences pregnant with unspoken meaning. They were hiding something, not from him, the outsider, but from themselves. A wound that was not of the water. The name came to him as a whisper, a splinter of sound in the drone of a hot, breathless afternoon. He was in a tent city that had sprung up near Marksville, a place of canvas and despair, sharing a tin cup of chicory coffee with a farmer whose eyes held the vacant stare of a man who had watched his entire world dissolve. Finney asked him about local legends, about the stories the flood would leave in its wake. The farmer spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He spoke of phantom lights on the water, of a spectral barge seen drifting through the flooded cypress groves. Common folklore, the kind that always surfaces in the wake of disaster. But then, his voice dropped, became conspiratorial, a dry rustle of sound. He spoke of a different kind of ghost, a story that had no place in the neat columns of a newspaper. He spoke of the Carter twins. The moment the name was uttered, a change occurred. The oppressive heat seemed to intensify, the air grew still, and the ever-present hum of the cicadas seemed to pause, as if listening. The farmer's eyes darted around, as though the name itself had the power to conjure something from the simmering air. He would say no more, waving away Finney's questions with a calloused hand, his face a mask of primal fear. It was the fear, more than the name, that snared Thomas F. Finney's journalistic instincts. This was not the fear of a natural disaster. This was the fear of a dark secret, a story that the mud had failed to bury. That night, Finney lay on his cot, the canvas walls of his tent breathing in the humid darkness. He could not shake the name. The Carter twins. It was not a story of survival, he knew that much. It was an unsettled debt, a discordant note in the parish's symphony of sorrow. The official record, as he would later learn from the weary Sheriff Brody, was simple, brutally so. Samuel and Elijah Carter, identical twin brothers, drowned. Their bodies, found lashed together with a length of rope, were recovered from their submerged farmhouse weeks after the levee broke. A tragic footnote in a deluge of death. But the way the farmer had spoken the name, the way a sudden watchful silence had fallen over the camp, that was not the sound of simple tragedy. It was the sound of a legend being born, or perhaps a curse being remembered. Finney felt a familiar, unwelcome thrill, the ghost limb of his former ambition beginning to ache. He told himself he was merely a chronicler, an observer of local color. But deep down, in the disgraced and hollowed-out parts of his soul, he knew he had stumbled upon something else entirely. He had come to Avoyelles Parish to write about the aftermath of a flood, about the battle between man and nature. He was about to discover that the most terrifying waters are not those that drown the land, but those that flow in the hearts of men, and that some echoes, once awakened, can never be silenced. The bayou had a story it wanted to tell, and it had chosen him as its reluctant prophet. The journalist's pursuit of a story is a peculiar form of hunger, an appetite for the narratives of others that can, in time, consume the man who hunts. For Thomas Finney, the name of the Carter twins became such an obsession. It was a dissonant chord that played beneath the drone of the cicadas, a mystery that promised something more than the simple, pitiable tales of loss he had been assigned to collect. He knew, with the instinct of a man who had once been good at his trade, that this was the wrong story. It was not a tale of resilience that would find favor with his editor in New Orleans. It was a story with thorns, a narrative that coiled back upon itself, dangerous and dark. And yet, he could not let it go. The official report, which he procured from Sheriff Brody over a cup of bitter, boiled coffee, was a monument to bureaucratic brevity. Samuel and Elijah Carter, aged 32, found June 17, 1927, in the attic of their flooded homestead. Cause of death, drowning. Noteworthy detail, bodies bound at the wrist, one to the other, with a 3-foot length of hemp rope. The sheriff, a man worn smooth by the ceaseless friction of tragedy, offered no embellishment. To him, it was just one more sorrow in a parish overflowing with them. A suicide pact, perhaps. A desperate act in the face of annihilation. Or maybe something worse. He did not care to speculate. The living required what little energy he had left. The dead could keep their secrets. But Finney knew that official reports are merely the tombstones of stories, not the stories themselves. The truth, if it existed at all, resided in the living memory of those left behind. And in the case of the Carter twins, that memory was fractured, divided between two women who now carried the weight of the Carter name. He learned of them from the postman, a grim man who navigated the muddy, half-drowned roads on a mule, his mailbag filled mostly with notices of foreclosure and letters of condolence. There were two widows, two women, both now Mrs. Carter, who had been married to two brothers so identical in feature that until their wedding days, many in the parish could not tell them apart. And in a stroke of strange folkloric poetry that felt uniquely of the bayou, both women were named Marie. They were known throughout the parish simply as the Two Marys, a designation that had once spoken of a shared, harmonious life and now signified a shared, irreconcilable grief. They did not live together. The flood and the darkness that came with it had driven a wedge of silence between them. They mourned in separate solitudes, each tending to a different version of the same devastating memory. Finney knew he had to speak to them both. He had to stand in the space between their sorrows and see what kind of truth might crystallize there. His first visit was to Marie Claire Carter, Samuel's widow. He found her not in a refugee tent, but in a small shotgun house that had been spared by the flood, perched on a rare rise of land that had become an island in the deluge. The house was a fortress against the encroaching chaos of the bayou. The porch was scrubbed raw. The windows were clean, and the air inside, though still heavy with the unavoidable humidity, was free of the pervasive stench of decay. Marie Claire was a tall, spare woman with hands that were never still, hands that perpetually scrubbed, mended, or straightened. Her grief was not a liquid thing of tears, but a hard, cold mineral that had formed in her eyes. It was a grief of anger, a focused, diamond-hard rage. She listened to Finney's purpose with a guarded stillness, her gaze sharp and assessing. When she spoke, her voice was like the snap of dry kindling. She offered him the rational truth, the truth of the solid world, the world before the water came and washed all sense away. Her Samuel, she explained, was the rock. He was the elder by 7 minutes, a fact he never let Elijah forget. Samuel was the one who planned, who built, who understood the logic of crops and ledgers. Elijah, she said, with a flicker of something that might have been pity or contempt, was the dreamer. His head was filled with the sky, with the whispers of the swamp, with the foolish superstitions their mother had fed them like mother's milk. She laid the blame for their deaths at the feet of a man, not a myth. A man named Beau Devereaux. The name slid from her lips with a venomous ease. Devereaux was a charmer and a bootlegger, a man who moved through the parish's shadowed economy of illegal stills and backroom deals. Before the flood, she said, there had been a dispute. Devereaux had wanted to lease a section of the Carter land, a secluded inlet perfect for moving his illicit goods down the bayou. Samuel, a man of rigid principle, had refused. The refusal had been sharp, public. Devereaux was not a man who took no for an answer. Marie Claire's theory was simple, brutal, and free of any supernatural taint. In the chaos of the rising water, when law and order had dissolved, Devereaux had seen his chance. He had gone to the Carter farm, perhaps to make one last violent appeal. An argument, a struggle, and then 2 bodies left for the water to claim. The rope? A cruel, theatrical flourish. A way to make a murder look like a suicide. A final act of desecration. She dismissed the local talk of curses and bayou spirits with a wave of her raw, chapped hand. That was the talk of frightened, ignorant people, she said. People who would rather believe in ghosts than in the simple, ugly fact that men can be monsters. As Finney left her scrubbed and sterile home, he held in his hands the framework of a comprehensible story. A story of greed, of violence, of a crime hidden by a catastrophe. It was a story fit for print. His journey to the second widow, Marie-Thérèse, Elijah's wife, was a journey into another world. Her shack was closer to the water's edge, nestled in a grove of cypress trees whose dangling moss seemed to weep in the humid air. Here, the battle against decay had been abandoned. The mud was allowed to claim the yard, and the scent of rot was mingled with the heavy, sweet smell of night-blooming jasmine, and something else, something herbal and incantatory. Marie-Thérèse was the mirror image of her sister-in-law, small, dark-eyed, and enveloped in a grief that was as fluid and formless as the water that had claimed her husband. Her sorrow was not a weapon, but a shroud. She sat on her porch, her hands idle in her lap, her gaze fixed on the shimmering black water of the bayou. She did not seem surprised by Finney's arrival, as if she had been expecting a visitor, a confessor. Her voice, when she spoke, was a low, melodic murmur, the sound of a prayer learned by heart. She did not speak of bootleggers or land disputes. Her story began generations ago, with a promise made and broken, a debt owed to the land, to the water. The Carter blood, she whispered, was marked. The men were born with the bayou in their souls, and sometimes the bayou called its own back home. Elijah, her Elijah, had always known. He was the one who felt the shift in the air, who could read the omens in the flight of a heron, or the pattern of ripples on the water. He was tied to Samuel not just by blood, but by something deeper, a bond that defied explanation. They shared thoughts, she said, felt each other's pain across miles. If Samuel was the rock, Elijah was the water that flows around it, the one who understood its depths. Weeks before the levee broke, Elijah had grown quiet, fatalistic. He dreamed of being underwater, of breathing in the silt, of a great peaceful silence. He spoke of a woman he had seen in his dreams, a woman of mud and moss who beckoned to him from below the surface. Marie-Thérèse spoke of Mama Odette, the ancient traiteur who lived deep in the swamp, an oracle who had told their mother when the twins were born that they were one soul in two bodies, and that their end would be in the water, together, as they had been in the womb. For Marie-Thérèse, their death was not a crime, but a grim apotheosis, the fulfillment of a destiny written in the stars long before they were born. The rope that bound them was not a murderer's tool, but a symbol of that unbreakable bond, a final tether ensuring that one would not enter the next world without the other. She did not weep as she told the story. Her face was a mask of serene, terrifying acceptance. She had not lost her husband to a man, but to a god, a hungry, ancient god who lived in the dark water of the bayou. Finney left her shack with his reporter's notebook feeling flimsy and useless in his hand. The neat, logical framework he had built at Marie Claire's house had dissolved. He now held two stories, two truths, as opposite as land and water, as reason and faith. One was a tale of human evil, the other of cosmic fate. He stood on the muddy bank, the oppressive silence of the evening descending around him, and looked out at the inscrutable face of the bayou. The truth, he suspected, was not in either woman's story, but in the terrifying, unbridgeable gulf that lay between them. The case of the Carter twins was no longer a simple footnote to a flood. It was a riddle with three possible answers: a murder, a curse, or a third, unthinkable thing that was beginning to take shape in the shadows of his mind. A madness born of two souls, bound too tightly together. A journalist is, by trade, a collector of facts, a builder of narratives upon a foundation of verifiable truth. Thomas Finney had always clung to this principle as a drowning man clings to a piece of wreckage. It was the only thing that separated his profession from the gossip and myth that festered in the dark, damp corners of the world. And so, he found himself clinging to the story of Marie Claire Carter, the story of the rock. It was a narrative with tangible elements, a property dispute, a known criminal, a motive as old as humanity itself: greed. This was a story he could investigate, He could find this Beau Devereaux, confront him, and watch his eyes for the flicker of deceit. He could peel back the layers of rumor and expose the hard, ugly kernel of a common crime. Yet, as he tried to anchor his thoughts to this solid ground, the story of Marie-Thérèse, the story of the water, lapped at the edges of his reason. Her words had been a strange and potent poison, seeping into the rational architecture of his mind. He found himself lying awake on his cot at night, the canvas of his tent no defense against the suffocating presence of the swamp. He heard whispers in the rustle of the palmetto leaves, saw faces in the gnarled roots of the cypress knees. The oppressive, rhythmic thrum of the cicadas began to sound like a language he almost understood, an ancient litany of sorrow and inevitability. The bayou was working on him, its atmospheric dread eroding the foundations of his skepticism. He was a man of the city, of cobblestone and gaslight, and this world of primordial mud and ceaseless humming life was beginning to feel less like a place and more like a conscious, breathing entity. Finding Beau Devereaux was not a matter of consulting a directory or knocking on a numbered door. In the fluid, lawless landscape of the post-flood parish, men like Devereaux did not reside. They presided. Their territories were marked by fear and favor, their whereabouts known only to those who were part of their shadowed ecosystem. Finney began his search in the makeshift taverns that had sprung up along the surviving levees, foul-smelling tents where men gambled away relief money and drank the raw, potent liquor that Devereaux and his kind supplied. At the mention of the name, conversations would halt. Men would suddenly find a deep interest in the dregs of their tin cups, their faces becoming blank, unreadable maps. Devereaux was a ghost, a rumor with a reputation for sudden, casual violence. But Finney was persistent, his desperation for a real lead overriding his caution. He learned, through a handful of coins and a feigned interest in acquiring a few bottles of Devereaux's product, that the man's operation had not been hindered by the flood, but enhanced by it. With the legitimate channels of commerce washed away, his illicit trade had become an essential service. He was told to follow the water, to look for a certain flat-bottomed boat with a faded serpent painted on its prow. For 2 days, Finney hired a sullen boy with a pirogue to guide him through the labyrinthine waterways, a world of drowned forests and disorienting beauty, where the sky and its reflection became one. He found him on the 3rd day. Not in a hidden still or a backwoods shack, but on a beached paddle steamer, a relic of a grander age that now sat half-sunk in the mud of a secluded inlet, its remaining deck converted into a floating fiefdom. Beau Devereaux was not the hulking brute Finney had imagined. He was a man of disarming charm, handsome in a way that seemed both refined and feral. He sat at a salvaged poker table, surrounded by a few quiet, watchful men, a bottle of amber liquid and a clean glass before him. He moved with a languid grace, his eyes, the color of swamp water, missing nothing. He smiled as Finney approached, a slow, knowing smile that suggested he had been expecting him. He gestured to an empty chair, a king granting an audience. The air was thick with the smell of whiskey, cigar smoke, and the ever-present dampness of the bayou. Finney, feeling the boy with the pirogue retreat behind him, stated his purpose, laying Marie-Claire's accusation on the table between them like a challenge. Devereaux did not flinch. He listened patiently, then let out a low, genuine laugh. It was not the laugh of a guilty man, nor an innocent one. It was the laugh of a man who found the very concepts of guilt and innocence to be quaint, amusing fictions. He admitted to the dispute freely. Samuel Carter, he said, pouring Finney a glass of his whiskey, was a man who thought the world ran on paper laws and Sunday sermons. A good man, perhaps, but a fool. A man who couldn't see that in a place like this, survival was the only law that mattered. But murder him? Devereaux leaned forward, his smile fading, his eyes hardening just enough to reveal the predator beneath the charm. The flood was chaos, he explained. But chaos is a kind of order to a man like him. It has currents, tides. You don't fight it, you ride it. When the levees broke, He wasn't settling old scores. He was miles upriver, moving his entire operation to higher ground, saving the very product that was now keeping the parish from going completely insane. He had witnesses, he said with a wave of his hand, though he knew as well as Finney that such witnesses were his own men, their testimony worthless. Then he fixed Finney with his gaze, and his voice dropped. "You're asking the wrong question, newspaper man," he said softly. "You're looking for a killer. You should be looking at the men who died." Devereaux proceeded to offer the third story, a version devoid of both Marie Claire's righteous anger and Marie-Thérèse's mystical acceptance. It was a story of decay, not of the body, but of the mind. He had known the Carter twins his whole life, had watched them from afar. He described them not as two brothers, but as one creature in a constant, desperate struggle with itself. Samuel was the cage, he said, and Elijah was the wild, terrified thing inside it. He spoke of Elijah's spells, how the boy would stare at nothing for hours, how he claimed to hear music coming from the mud. And he spoke of Samuel's frantic, exhausting effort to appear normal, to force his brother, his other half, to conform to the solid world. That bond they had, Devereaux mused, swirling the whiskey in his glass. It wasn't natural. One got a cut, the other bled. One had a bad dream, the other woke up screaming. You see that long enough, you realize you're not looking at two people. The flood, in Devereaux's telling, was not the weapon that killed them, but the catalyst that completed their dissolution. The rising water, the end of the world as they knew it, was too much for Elijah's fragile psyche. And when Elijah finally broke, when he fully succumbed to the whispers of the water he'd been hearing his whole life, he took Samuel with him. The rope wasn't a killer's signature or a spiritual tether. It was the last desperate act of a man trying to hold on to the only thing he had ever truly known, his other self. The bayou didn't drown them, Devereaux concluded, his voice barely a whisper. It just gave them permission to let go. Thomas Finney left the paddle steamer with the taste of strong whiskey on his tongue and a cold dread in his stomach. Devereaux was a liar and a criminal. Of that he was certain. He was entirely capable of the crime of which he was accused. And yet, the psychological portrait he had painted of the twins was terrifyingly vivid, more detailed and strangely more compassionate than either of the widow's accounts. He had given a name and a shape to the unspoken third possibility, the theory of a shared madness. Finney had come seeking a villain and had found another storyteller, a pragmatist of the swamp who saw the world not in terms of good and evil, but of the sane and the broken. The journalist stood on the bank of the bayou, the setting sun turning the stagnant water to blood, and felt his neat, orderly investigation splintering into three irreconcilable paths. The murderer, the curse, the madness. 3 stories, born of the same tragedy, each casting the others in shadow, each feeling equally, terribly plausible. The truth of the Carter twins was no longer a matter of digging in the mud for facts. It was a matter of choosing which abyss he was willing to stare into. There is a point in any prolonged investigation into the darkness where the darkness begins to investigate you. Thomas Finney, the rationalist, the skeptic, the man of print and verified sources, began to feel this reciprocal gaze in the deepest hours of the Louisiana night. Sleep offered no refuge, only a humid tapestry of disjointed images. Marie Claire's hands, scrubbing at a stain that would never lift. Marie-Thérèse's vacant eyes, reflecting an endless expanse of black water. Beau Devereaux's predatory smile, forming and dissolving in the cigar smoke. And behind it all, the image of 2 identical faces, their features blurred by water, bound together for eternity. His notebook, once a source of comfort and order, now felt like a catalog of competing insanities. Every testimony he had gathered seemed to cancel the others out, leaving him with a perfect, horrifying equilibrium of doubt. Marie Claire's story was the anchor to the world he understood, a world of motive and consequence. But the anchor was dragging. The force of this place, its suffocating atmosphere of belief and dread, was pulling him toward a different kind of understanding, one that had no place in the columns of a newspaper. He found himself rereading Marie-Thérèse's testimony, her mention of an old woman, a seer, a name that felt like a stone dropped into the placid surface of his logic. Mama Odette. To seek her out, he knew, was to cross a line. It was an act of journalistic heresy, an abandonment of his creed. It was a concession that the truth might not be found in the daylight world of fact, but in the twilight realm of myth. He told himself it was for context, for local color, a final piece of folklore to round out the story. But it was a lie, a thin veil for his own desperation. He was going because he was lost, and he had come to believe that the map he was using was for a different country entirely. Getting to Mama Odette was not like following a road. It was like trying to find a specific drop of water in a river. The people in the tent cities and salvaged towns, who had spoken of Beau Devereaux in fearful whispers, spoke of Mama Odette with something far more profound, a deep and reverent silence. She was not a part of their world. She was a part of the world their world sat upon, a piece of the old magic, the pre-Christian soul of the swamp. To seek her was to meddle with things best left alone. It took Finney days to find a guide, and the one he found was not a man, but a boy, no older than 15, who was said to have the sight, and who navigated the backwaters as if he had been born with a pirogue attached to his feet. The boy spoke no English, only the parish's patois French, and he did not ask for money. His price was Finney's pocket watch, a silver heirloom that had marked the steady, reliable time of a world Finney was no longer sure existed. The boy took it without a word and gestured for him to get into the boat. The journey that followed was a slow, silent regression through time. They left the wide, muddy arteries of the floodwaters and entered the capillaries, the narrow, winding passages choked with water hyacinth and shadowed by a canopy of ancient cypress so thick it turned the midday sun into a dim, greenish twilight. The air grew still and heavy, smelling of wet earth, of decay, and of blossoms that bloomed only in the dark. The sounds of the civilized world faded, replaced by the prehistoric croak of a hidden bullfrog, the splash of a gar, the unnerving sensation of being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. The world became a disorienting hall of mirrors, with gnarled roots and weeping moss reflected perfectly in the biang, lac, glassy water, making it impossible to tell where the world ended and its ghost began. Mama Odette's home was not built upon the swamp. It was an extension of it. A small, crooked house on high stilts, fused to the trunk of a colossal cypress that was surely 1,000 years old. The structure seemed organic, its wood the color of weathered bone, its roof a thatch of palmetto leaves. Strings of snail shells, bird skulls, and alligator teeth clicked together in the slight breeze, a primitive wind chime. The boy would go no further, pointing a slim finger toward the rickety ladder that led to the cabin's porch, before turning his pirogue and vanishing back into the green labyrinth, leaving Finney utterly alone. As he climbed, the ladder groaning under his weight, he felt as if he were ascending into a place outside of time. The woman who sat on the porch was as ancient as the tree she lived in. Her face was a web of deep wrinkles, her skin the texture of dried tobacco leaf, but her eyes were startlingly alive, small, black, and sharp, holding a lucidity that was both unsettling and profound. She was weaving a net from strands of Spanish moss, her gnarled fingers moving with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. She did not look up as he reached the top. "You took a long time to come," she said, her voice a dry rasp, like leaves skittering across stone. "The question you carry is a heavy one. It makes you walk slow." Finney, his prepared questions dissolving in his throat, felt the last vestiges of his journalistic persona crumble away. He was not an interviewer. He was a supplicant. He began to explain, to speak of the twins, the widows, the bootlegger, but she raised a hand to silence him. "I know the stories," she said. "The woman who builds a house of anger to keep the water out. The woman who drowns herself in sorrow so she can breathe. The snake who thinks the swamp belongs to him. They all tell their own truth, but a truth is not the truth. She looked at him then, her gaze piercing, stripping him of his defenses. You want to know who killed the Carter boys? You think the answer is a name. You are a fool. You don't ask the storm who killed the tree. She told him what she had told the twins' mother 32 years before, on the day of their birth. She had held the 2 infants in her hands and felt not 2 lives, but one. A single soul poured unevenly into 2 vessels, one of stone, one of water. The soul was too old, she said, and it carried a debt from a long time ago, a promise made to the bayou that had been broken by an ancestor. The bayou does not forget. This place, she said, her hand gesturing to the vast living swamp around them. It is a hungry place. It gives, but it always takes back. It demands balance. That one soul was born with the water's mark on it. It was always meant to go home. All the rest, the fight with the snake, the madness of the rising tide, that was just the swamp choosing its moment, deciding how the debt would be paid. There was no distinguishing fate from madness or murder in her telling. They were all simply instruments of a more ancient elemental will. Devereaux's hand, Elijah's visions, Samuel's struggle. They were all threads she was weaving into her net. To her, the rope that bound the twins was not a clue, but the punchline to a long, cosmic joke. The final physical manifestation of a bond that had been forged in a place beyond human understanding, for a purpose beyond human reason. She saw no tragedy in their death, only a conclusion. A closing of a circle. A debt paid in full. Before Finney left, she pressed something into his hand. It was a small, smooth black stone, cool to the touch. The bayou gives you a story, she rasped. But it takes one too. Be careful which one you give it. Finney descended the ladder in a daze, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting ideas. The encounter had not brought clarity. It had brought a terrifying sense of scale. He had been looking at a human tragedy, and she had shown him a geological event, a spiritual transaction as slow and inexorable as the turning of the earth. He found his way back to the main channel, stumbling through the mud like a sleepwalker. The world of men, of sheriffs and newspapers and deadlines, seemed distant and absurd. He sat on the bank of the river, the black stone from Mama Odette growing strangely warm in his palm, and he felt a profound and chilling certainty. He understood now that he wasn't just reporting on the legend of the Carter twins. He was becoming a part of it. The swamp had its storytellers, and it had just recruited a new one. The voices of the living had offered Thomas Finney no sanctuary, only a triptych of plausible despairs. Each narrative, murder, madness, myth, was a self-contained truth, a perfect and impenetrable sphere of belief. To accept one was to deny the others, yet to deny any of them felt like a lie. He had exhausted the living, and now, in the grip of an obsession that had long since shed its journalistic pretense, he felt a grim and inexorable pull toward the dead. He had to see the place. He had to stand in the room where the final scene had played out. The Carter homestead, which had been for weeks an abstract location on a waterlogged map, now became a focal point for his fractured investigation, a silent witness he felt compelled to interrogate. It was no longer a search for clues. It was a pilgrimage to the heart of the echo, a need to breathe the air of the tomb itself. He rented a mule, the only reliable transport in the parish's ruined arteries, and set out at dawn, the small black stone from Mama Odette, a cold, dense weight in his pocket. The journey was a passage through a landscape of abject surrender. The further he moved from the relative civilization of Marksville, the more complete the devastation became. The earth itself seemed to have given up, its rich alluvial soil buried under a sterile blanket of gray, sun-cracked silt. Skeletal trees clawed at the sky, their branches draped in rags of debris left by the receding water, like the tattered prayer flags of some forgotten, sorrowful religion. There was no birdsong, only the ceaseless, maddening drone of insects and the rhythmic sucking sound of the mule's hooves pulling free from the muck. He smelled the Carter farm before he saw it, a unique concentration of the parish's general decay, the specific and intimate odor of a single drowned life. A collapsed barn listed into a field of mud, its timbers softened with rot. A rusted tractor was buried to its axles, a monument to a harvest that would never come. And then the house, sitting stark and alone under the oppressive weight of the sky. It was a simple 2-story farmhouse, but the flood had stripped it of all domesticity. It looked violated, its windows vacant eyes, its front door hanging ajar like a broken jaw. The waterline, a distinct muddy scar 4 feet up the clapboard siding, served as a high-water mark for both the flood and the tragedy. Finney tethered the mule to a fence post that leaned at a drunken angle and approached the house, his own footsteps unnaturally loud in the profound silence. Inside, the world was coated in a uniform film of dried mud, a monochrome preservation of chaos. Furniture was overturned, swollen, and split. A child's rocking horse lay on its side, its painted smile obscured by a crust of dirt. In the kitchen, shattered plates were embedded in the hardened silt on the floor. It was a place where a violent struggle with the force of nature had been lost, and the silence it left behind was absolute. Finney moved through the room slowly, a trespasser in a sealed memory. He could almost feel the presence of the 2 Marys here, imposing their conflicting narratives onto the wreckage. He imagined Marie-Claire's Samuel, the pragmatist, frantically moving valuables to the 2nd floor, his actions logical and precise, even in the face of annihilation. He could picture him measuring the water's rise, calculating their chances, a man of reason battling an unreasonable God. Then, in the same space, he saw Marie-Thérèse's Elijah, the mystic, not fighting the water, but listening to it, his ear turned to the sound of its approach as if it were a familiar voice. Finney ran a hand along a wall, his fingers coming away with gray dust, and saw a faint outline where a crucifix had once hung, a symbol of a faith that had proven useless against the older, hungrier faith of the bayou. He felt like a ghost, drifting through the memories of other ghosts, each step stirring the cold ashes of a life that had ended in terror and confusion. He knew he was delaying, putting off the final ascent. But the house, like the story itself, seemed to be pulling him upward, toward the source. The stairs to the attic groaned under his weight, each step a protest against his intrusion. The air grew warmer, thicker, tasting of dust and time and enclosure. He pushed open the attic door and was met by a wave of suffocating heat. It was a small, raw space under the eaves, with a single round window caked with dirt, allowing only a sliver of jaundiced light to pierce the gloom. And it was here that the presence of the twins felt terrifyingly immediate. This was their final sanctuary, their prison, the stage for their last act. For a long while, he simply stood there, letting his eyes adjust, his heart hammering against his ribs. The space was empty, stripped of whatever they had brought with them by the sheriff's men. But they had left something behind. On the plaster of the far wall, near the window, he saw it, scratched into the surface were 2 distinct sets of marks. On the left, a neat, orderly series of 31 vertical lines, with a final 30-second line slashed horizontally through the last 4. The methodical tally of a man counting the days, a prisoner marking his time. Samuel's mark, a testament to his desperate, rational need to impose order on the chaos. But beside it, the second set of markings was a vortex of madness. It was a chaotic, spiraling glyph, scratched over and over, the lines digging deep into the plaster, radiating outward from a central point. It was hypnotic, disturbing. It looked like a whirlpool, or a staring, unblinking eye, or the sigil of some forgotten religion. It was the mark of a mind that had not been counting the days, but had been trying to claw its way into another reality altogether. Elijah's mark, Finney stared at the wall, mesmerized. It was all there. The entire story, etched into the plaster. The rock and the water. The cage and the wild thing. The two opposing forces, bound together in this suffocating space, their separate realities diverging into madness even as their bodies remained tethered. He knelt, his eyes scanning the dusty floorboards, and saw a small dark object near the wall. He picked it up. It was a single inch-long piece of hemp rope, stiff with age and damp, its fibers frayed. It was nothing, a piece of trash overlooked in the cleanup. But as he held it in his palm, it felt like the key, the knot, the central, unsolvable point of the entire mystery. He stood in the sweltering attic, the tally marks of logic on one side, the spiral of madness on the other, the physical remnant of the rope that bound them in his hand, and he felt a dizzying, terrifying moment of synthesis. It wasn't a murder, or a curse, or a shared psychosis. It was all of them. It was a murder committed by a curse that took the form of madness. The pressure from Devereaux, the rising water, the isolation, the ancient prophecy, the unraveling of their shared soul. It had all converged in this room and ended with a rope. He had come seeking a fact to anchor his story, and instead he had found a terrible, unholy poem. He fled the house as dusk began to bleed across the sky, leaving the ghosts to their suffocating silence. He did not look back. He now knew that the truth of what happened to the Carter twins could never be written in the clean, factual language of a newspaper. It could only be felt, like the oppressive heat of a locked room, or the cold, final weight of a stone in a dead man's pocket. A man who has visited a tomb does not return the same. Thomas Finney rode back from the drowned Carter homestead under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, the silence of the attic clinging to him like a shroud. The world he had known, a place of causes and effects, of headlines and deadlines, had receded to a distant shore, leaving him stranded in a landscape of terrible ambiguity. The glyphs on the attic wall were burned into his memory. One, a desperate accounting of fading time. The other, a spiral into timeless madness. He was no longer a journalist on assignment. He was a haunted man, a courier of a message he could not decipher, carrying relics in his pocket, a stone of prophecy, and a scrap of the rope that had served as the final, terrible punctuation mark. He felt an urgent, hollow need to close the circle, to return to the law, the last bastion of the rational world he had once inhabited. He needed to see Sheriff Brody, not to demand answers, but to bear witness, to lay the fragments of his shattered investigation at the feet of authority and see if they could be pieced into any recognizable shape. It was the last, desperate act of a man still pretending his old map had some relevance in this new territory. Sheriff Brody's office was a small room behind the parish jail, a place that smelled of damp paper, stale coffee, and the quiet desperation of a man tasked with holding back the tide with a tea-cup. The flood had not just broken the levees, it had broken the very idea of order, and Brody was the weary custodian of its remnants. Piles of documents, damage claims, missing persons reports, requisitions for lime, rose from his desk like sedimentary layers of sorrow. He looked up as Finney entered, his eyes shadowed with a fatigue so profound it seemed geological. He saw not a journalist, but a fellow survivor, and in Finney's face, he recognized the specific haunt of the Carter case. Finney did not present his findings with any journalistic pretense. His voice was low, confessional. He spoke of the two Marys and their opposing testaments of rage and faith. He spoke of Devereaux's chillingly rational explanation of a shared insanity. He sketched the two symbols from the attic wall into his notebook and pushed it across the desk. He spoke of an oracle in the deep swamp who saw it all as a debt being paid. He was not making a case. He was unburdening himself, laying out the pieces of an impossible puzzle. He took the frayed piece of hemp from his pocket and placed it on the desk. It lay there between them, small and inert, yet pulsing with the weight of the entire story. Brody listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the piece of rope. The cynical, exhausted mask he wore in public began to crack, revealing the parish man beneath. A man who had known the Carter boys since they were children, who had seen them at church socials and bought their produce at market. When Finney finished, a long silence filled the room, thick with the hum of flies against the window pane. Finally, the sheriff sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the very bedrock of his soul. "I knew it wasn't simple," he said, his voice raspy. "You don't live your whole life here and believe in simple things." He reached under a stack of papers and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with his neat, official script. He opened it to the entry for the Carter twins. It was exactly as he had described it. Spall, ris, factual, clinical. Drowning. Bodies recovered. Case closed. But then he did something else. He unlocked a small drawer in his desk and removed a second book, a small, cheap notebook like Finney's own. Its pages were filled with a messier script, with crossed-out lines and marginalia. This was his private ledger, the book of things that could not be written in the official history of the parish. He flipped through the pages, his thumb smudged with ink. "There were things," he said, not looking at Finney, but at the words he had written. Things that didn't fit. He explained that the attic door, a heavy wooden thing, had been barred from the inside with a thick beam of oak. There was no other way in or out. For Devereaux to have killed them, he would have had to vanish through the walls. He spoke of the rope itself. The knot that bound their wrists, he said, was a waterman's knot, a complex and specific knot used by deep-water sailors, something he had not seen since his time in the war. No one in the parish, least of all 2 farm boys who had never been 50 miles from home, would have known how to tie it. There were no tracks leading to or from the house in the first days, save for those of the brothers themselves. It was as if they had been sealed in, alone with the rising water and whatever was in that room with them. He had buried these facts in his private book because to include them in an official report would be to admit that he was investigating a ghost story. It would be to acknowledge the possibility of an event that defied the very laws he was sworn to uphold. "So what do you believe?" Finney asked, his voice barely a whisper. Brody finally looked up, his eyes filled with a profound and terrible sadness. "I believe," the sheriff said slowly, "that my job is to keep this parish from tearing itself apart. I have one woman who needs to believe her husband band was murdered by a villain because hate is an easier thing to carry than fear. I have another woman who needs to believe her husband was taken by God or the devil or the swamp itself, because destiny is an easier thing to carry than madness. I have a bootlegger who is a cancer in this parish, but whose liquor is the only medicine some men have left. And I have 100 other families who have lost everything and just need to believe that the world, for all its horrors, still makes some kind of sense." He closed the private notebook and pushed it back into the drawer. "Writing drowning in that ledger was the most honest thing I could do. It's not the truth. It's just the story that lets everyone else go on living. Some things, Mr. Finney, you don't get to the bottom of. You just find a way to put them back in the ground." Thomas Finney left the sheriff's office and stepped out into the blinding late afternoon sun. The final authority had spoken. The law was not a pursuer of truth, but a manager of narratives, a creator of the fictions necessary for survival. Brody had not solved the mystery. He had confirmed its insolubility. He had drawn a final official line around the darkness and declared it closed. But Finney knew it wasn't. It was open, and he was now its sole custodian. All the external avenues were exhausted. The widows had told their stories. The suspect had told his. The oracle had spoken. The law had abdicated. There was no one left to appeal to, no higher authority to consult. He was alone with the ghosts, the glyphs, and the impossible knot. He walked through the dusty streets of Marksville, a man adrift, and realized there was only one thing left for him to do. He had to write. He had to sit down and confront the story in the only way he knew how, to try and force its impossible shape into the unforgiving structure of black ink on white paper. The investigation was over. The haunting was about to begin. There is a unique and tall, arable solitude that belongs to the storyteller who possesses a tale that cannot, or should not, be told. Thomas Finney returned from the sheriff's office and sealed himself in his small airless room at the boarding house in Marksville. The world outside, with its commerce of grief and survival, ceased to exist. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of this single room, a space that felt increasingly like the attic of the Carter homestead. The same oppressive heat, the same suffocating silence between the drone of the cicadas, the same feeling of being in a place where a final, terrible accounting was due. He set a stack of blank paper on the rickety wooden desk, alongside his notebook, which now felt less like a record of facts and more like a grimoire of forbidden spells. He uncorked a bottle of the amber whiskey he had bought from one of Devereaux's men, a communion with one of the story's devils. The bottle, the paper, the pen. These were the tools of his trade, the instruments he had once used to impose a clean, rational order on the chaos of the world. Now they seemed like a fool's implements, pitifully inadequate for the task at hand. He had come to Avoyelles Parish to write a story. Now, he understood the story intended to write him. His first attempt was an act of rebellion, a desperate retreat to the solid ground he had known. He dipped his pen in the ink and began to write the story of Marie Claire, the story of the rock. Hidden in Flood's havoc, a tale of brutal murder. The headline read in his mind. He wrote of the land dispute, of Beau Devereaux's known ruthlessness, of the lawless chaos of the flood providing the perfect cover for a crime. He marshaled the facts as he knew them, constructing a neat, linear narrative of human greed. But the words tasted like ash in his mouth. With every sentence, he saw the impossible image of the attic door, barred from within. He heard Sheriff Brody's voice describing the sailor's knot. He saw the swirling mad glyph on the plaster wall. This story, so logical and clean, was a profound lie, an act of violence against the deeper, stranger truth of the place. It was a story that explained the bodies, but not the ghosts. With a curse, he crushed the paper into a tight ball and threw it into a corner, the first casualty in a long and bloody battle. His second attempt was a concession to the modern age, a story of psychology, the version Devereaux himself had so chillingly articulated. A bond of blood, a folie à deux, the tragic end of the Carter twins. He wrote of the unnatural codependence, of the sensitive soul of Elijah pulling his steadfast brother down into a shared psychosis. He used the clinical, detached language of the popular science he read in the New Orleans papers, painting a picture of mental illness exacerbated by catastrophic stress. This version felt colder, and in its own way, truer. It accounted for the strangeness, for the final desperate act of a mind breaking apart. And yet, it too was a lie. It was a sterile, godless explanation that had no room for the power of the bayou, for Marie-Thérese's deep, unshakable faith, for the piercing, ancient wisdom in Mama Odette's eyes. This story explained the madness, but it did not explain the magic. It ignored the prophecy. It dismissed the feeling Finney had in the deep swamp, the feeling of a conscious, watching presence. This was a story for a city, for men who believed they had tamed the world. It was not the story of this place. The second sheet of paper joined the first in the corner. He drank the whiskey, its raw heat a welcome anesthetic. The lines between the stories, between the voices of his witnesses, began to blur. He was feverish, the sweat pasting his shirt to his skin. He surrendered for a moment to the story of the water, the story of Marie-Thérèse and Mama Odette. He tried to write it as a folktale, a piece of Gothic local color. He wrote of the bayou's ancient curse, of the soul with a debt to pay, of the water rising to claim its own. He wrote of omens and visions and a woman made of mud and moss. The language flowed more easily, the narrative taking on a dark, lyrical power. But as he wrote, he felt a wave of self-loathing. This was an exploitation. It turned the real, visceral agony of two women into a cheap thrill for Sunday readers. It transformed the brutal, terrifying end of two men into a quaint superstition, a ghost story to be told around a fire. It was the worst lie of all, for it acknowledged the mystery only to trivialize it. The third ball of paper joined the others. The pile in the corner was growing, a testament to his failure. He was trapped. To tell one story was to betray the others. To tell a simple truth was to tell the greatest lie. He laid his head on the desk, the smell of ink and whiskey filling his senses. The room seemed to press in on him, and the chorus of the cicadas rose in pitch until it sounded like a scream. The voices of the parish filled his head. He was a rock, my Samuel. The bayou called him home. The water didn't get in their lungs. It got in their heads. The swamp is a hungry place. Some things you don't solve. You just survive them. The voices swirled together, a vortex of conflicting truths, pulling him down like the spiral on the attic wall. He was drowning in the story, in the oppressive, inescapable humidity of its contradictions. And in that moment of surrender, as the whiskey and the heat and the exhaustion finally broke him, a new and terrifying clarity emerged. He had been trying to solve the riddle, but his job was not to solve it. His job was to present the riddle itself, in all its terrible, insoluble glory. The story was not about what happened to the Carter twins. The story was about the story of what happened to the Carter twins. It was about the way that murder, madness, and myth had converged in the crucible of a flood and birthed a legend. He was not meant to be a detective, exposing a killer. He was meant to be an evangelist, preaching a gospel of doubt. With a shaking hand, Thomas Finney took a fresh sheet of paper. He ignored his notes. He ignored the crumpled lies in the corner. He dipped his pen, and this time, he did not begin with a man, or a crime, or a motive. He began where the story itself had begun. He began with the water. There is a memory imprinted upon the mud of Avoyelles Parish, he wrote, the scratching of his pen the only sound in the room, a sound that pushed back, however feebly, against the enveloping darkness. A story the silt still tells when the air grows heavy and the cicadas drone their vespers. It is a tale not of water alone, but of what the water unburies and what it chooses to keep forever. He did not know it then, but in that sweltering room, in that act of final, desperate surrender, he ceased to be a mere journalist. He had become the first chronicler of the legend, the ordained scribe of the bayou's echo, giving the parish's whispered fears a voice that would carry far beyond the drowned fields and the cypress groves, ensuring that the ghosts of Samuel and Elijah Carter would never truly rest. He wrote through the night, the pile of finished pages growing, not a solution, but a perfect and chilling monument to a question that could never be unanswered. Dawn broke over Avoyelles Parish, a smear of pale, sickly light against the eastern sky. Inside the small room at the boarding house, Thomas Finney sat amidst the detritus of his long night's war, a survivor on a battlefield of crumpled paper. The whiskey bottle was empty. The inkwell was nearly dry. Before him lay a thick stack of pages, covered in his dense, feverish script. It was done. He felt no triumph, no elation of a story finally conquered. He felt only a profound and hollow emptiness, the feeling of a vessel that has been filled and then drained of something potent and ancient. He had not wrestled the story into submission. He had allowed it to possess him, to speak through his pen. He had served as its medium, and now the séance was over. The manuscript on his desk was not a piece of journalism. It was a confession, an exorcism, a map of a haunting. It offered no conclusions, no accusations, no neat and tidy resolution. It was merely a faithful transcription of an echo. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was the truest thing he had ever written. His departure from the parish was as quiet and indistinct as the morning mist rising from the bayou. There were no farewells. The story was a burden he now carried alone, and there was nothing left to say to the other souls trapped in its orbit. As his hired car rumbled over the temporary wooden bridge that led out of Marksville, he caught a glimpse of Sheriff Brody standing on the steps of his office, watching him go. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the muddy street, and in that shared glance, a silent acknowledgement passed between them. It was the look of two men who have stood together at the edge of an open grave and agreed, without words, to let it lie. Finney gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and the sheriff touched the brim of his hat in return. The car moved on, and the parish, with its sorrows and its secrets, receded in the dust behind him. But he knew with an absolute certainty that he was not leaving it behind. He was taking it with him. He could still feel the weight of the black stone in his pocket, a permanent souvenir from a country from which no traveler truly returns. Back in the clamor and relative sanity of New Orleans, his editor read the manuscript with a mounting sense of bewilderment and dismay. This was not the story he had been promised. Where were the heroes? Where was the uplifting narrative of human spirit, triumphing over natural disaster? This was something else entirely. It was a dense, lyrical, and deeply unsettling piece of Gothic prose. A fever dream of a story that read more like a forbidden chapter of local folklore than a piece of reportage. It was morbid, ambiguous, and commercially useless. The editor was ready to reject it outright, but he found he could not. The story had a strange, compelling power. It was repellent, yet hypnotic. It was the kind of story that, once read, could not be unread. With a heavy sigh of resignation, he agreed to publish it, not as a feature, but buried deep within the Sunday edition's literary supplement, a curiosity for those with an appetite for the strange. He titled it simply, Bayou's Echo. The article did not cause a sensation. It did not launch an official inquiry, or lead to the arrest of Beau Devereaux. For the world outside of Avoyelles, it was a minor macabre tale, soon forgotten. But in the parish itself, the story landed like a stone in a still, black pond, the ripples spreading out to touch everyone. It gave a name and a form to the unspoken dread that had lingered since the flood. It took the scattered whispers, the conflicting rumors, and the deep-seated fears, and wove them into a single cohesive legend. For Marie-Claire, it was an insult, a fanciful piece of nonsense that distracted from the simple, brutal fact of her husband's murder. She would cling to her anger, her rational hatred of Beau Dive, Réau, until the end of her days. For Marie-Thérèse, the article was scripture. It was the validation of everything she knew in her heart to be true, a testament to the power and the mystery of the place that had claimed her husband. She would cut the story from the newspaper and keep it pressed in her family Bible, a sacred text. Beau Devereaux, it was said, read it at his table on the beached paddle steamer and laughed, a long, genuine laugh of amusement. He saw his own cynical truth reflected in the article's refusal to pass judgment, and its publication only enhanced his mystique as a man who walked with the parish's ghosts. The article changed nothing, and it changed everything. It solved no crime, but it immortalized the mystery, transforming a private tragedy into a public myth, ensuring that the Carter twins belonged to the Bayou forever. Thomas Finney never got his redemption. The article earned him a small, peculiar reputation as a writer of the macabre, but it did not restore his career. He found he could no longer write the simple, factual stories of his past. He had lost his faith in the clean narrative, in the idea that truth was a thing that could be neatly captured and pinned to a page. He had been a cartographer of facts, and he had been shown a world that was not on any map. He continued to work, but his writing was always shadowed by what he had seen in Avoyelles, forever touched by its Gothic gloom. He was no longer a journalist seeking truth, but an archivist of echoes, a man who understood that some stories are not meant to be solved, only to be told, and that the act of telling is its own form of haunting. The real truth, the final objective fact of what happened in that sweltering attic between two brothers bound by a rope remains unknown. It lies drowned in the silt, a secret the water chose to keep. All that is left is the legend, A story, too. Hat rises from the mud like a vapor on a hot summer night. A story of murder, of madness, of a terrible and ancient magic. A story of a bayou that remembers, and a bayou that always, eventually, claims what it is owed.